In this section, we will come back to some of the core problems of cultural evolution, which is the accuracy of cultural transmission, or the fidelity problem. And this is actually something that I will lump together a couple of different lines of research and lines of argument, but I think they highlight some general kind of problems that cultural evolution still has to grapple with. The first issue we have to quickly come back to is that genetic mutations have very high fidelity. There are copy failures induced by external influences like radiation, lifestyle, etc. But then mutations that happen, only those mutations that happen in the germ cells are actually being passed on, and these mutations can be silent, so have no effects. They might have some negative effect, or potentially at some stage they may also have some positive effect. But there's on average a very high fidelity, so high accuracy of the information being copied. If it wasn't the case, you would not be listening to me talking right now, because these mutations typically have strong negative effects, and we would not be alive today as individuals. So now what happens with cultural transmission though is we have to think about that there is an idea in our head that needs to be transformed into an action that leads to some outcome, like an artifact, which this whole process needs to be observed by somebody else who understands what the individual is doing, so creates a similar kind of idea in their mind, and then needs to copy that behavior to come up with the same product or cultural artifact at the end. And this raises a number of additional complexities that need to be considered from a cultural evolution perspective. So this is the problem of fidelity. What we know from work by Hannah Lewis and Kevin Leyland, based on mathematical simulations, is that fidelity is actually key for cumulative culture to emerge. So this is taking some ideas by Michael Tomasello and testing them through these mathematical simulations, and what they find is that the fidelity of transmission is absolutely crucial for cultural traits to stay within a population. So if you increase the error rate of a transmission process, you will lose the cultural information very fast within a population, and this is also to some extent population size dependent. So you need to have high fidelity in order to get cumulative culture off the ground. But this is actually quite challenging to work through, because on one hand we have to think about there are different ways of thinking about fidelity, and this article by Charbonneau raises or identifies the problems with the concept of fidelity, because it's kind of a big package concept, and there's a lot of stuff going on within it that is not really well defined and thought through. Because if we think about cultural traditions, let's take for example monkeys using a stone and to crack nuts, right? So does it matter what kind of stone is being taken and whether you use the right arm or the left arm or both arms together in order to crack the nut? Then the next question is, if we really think about accuracy of behavior, does it matter whether the animal actually stands upright or sits down? Would that actually make a difference? And if we think about all sorts of cultural traditions, we have all sorts of really weird behaviors, and that are often where specific details might actually be very important. So if we think about cultural rituals, does it matter whether you face north when doing a certain action, and it only is efficient and effective if you do it on a full moon, right? So these are all sorts of questions about episodic fidelity, which entail the accuracy of the of the process of creating the product, and whether the final product is actually comparable or not. And then of course we have mechanism or propensity fidelity, which deals with the way the information is being passed on, right? So these are the kind of transmission processes, the learning and teaching styles. So Charbonneau actually argues that these two types of fidelity are challenging but can be worked through. What is the problem, though? That most cultural evolution researchers put it all together into what is called generalized fidelity, which encompasses all and everything, and therefore becomes, from a scientific perspective, really hard to track. And so his challenge to cultural evolution researchers is that we have to pay more attention to what we actually mean by fidelity or accuracy in the transmission process. What defines what counts as an accurate transmission process? This is something that really begs further both theoretical and empirical work, because this is something that at the moment is relatively unpackaged, even though it is so central to the whole idea of cumulative culture. So there are lots of opportunities for future research. But this also immediately then also leads to another very interesting line of research, which is related to transmission biases. And there are so many different transmission biases of how information is being paid attention to and passed on in human societies, that make it quite interesting and challenging to think through how it is actually possible that we can have functioning societies with all these biases. So I will take you through some of them here. The first one is so-called content biases. So this is related to the information that is being passed on, and whether the information actually has a higher or lower probability of being paid attention to, remembered, and then passed on to others. So this can relate to genetic biases, so inherent limitations of our biological system, or it can be cultural preferences. So genetic biases could be, for example, how much information we can store in our brain. So we have these kind of memory limits of about 5 plus minus 2 pieces of information, or 7 plus minus 2 pieces of information. There are all these kind of discussions of actually how big, how much memory we have available for storing information. So this would be an example of genetic bias. And then we have, of course, all sorts of social preferences and cultural preferences. There's a lot of research that seems to suggest that our brain has evolved. So this is insight from evolutionary psychology in the traditional way, to pay attention to social information. So the idea that gossip spreads faster through social networks compared to other information, because it's important for enforcing and regulating social relationships. That's one of the core arguments by people like Robin Dunbar. And there are all sorts of inductive cognitive biases, cognitive attractors, that make it more or less likely for certain information to be paid attention to, being remembered and passed on to others compared to others, other types of information. And this is also really important next week when we start talking about religion, because religion uses a lot of social information that we are familiar with, but then always packages the information in slightly unusual ways, like entities being able to pass through physical structures like walls, or being able to read your minds even from a distance. So these minimally counterintuitive beliefs have been shown to pass on more efficiently through social networks again. So a second type of biases is related to frequency. whether we pay more attention to what is around us, so like copying, like conformist bias, so copying like the most relevant or most frequently displayed information, or paying attention to what is distinct, so novelty. And conformist biases tend to work relatively well in more stable environment, whereas novelty biases are more frequent in more rapidly changing environments, but also characterize all sorts of fashions and fads. So right at the beginning of the course, we had all these kind of strange behaviors at the time of Darwin, like women copying, like the high class society customs where sugar was actually available or affordable for high class individuals, but of course it would affect their teeth, so you would have a lot of rotten teeth among higher class individuals, and so lower classes would start painting their teeth black in order to simulate higher social status, or customs like bloodletting, for example. Right? So we have all these kind of strange frequency dependent biases that make the concept of cultural evolution quite difficult if you really think through it, and raise questions about how it actually, like adaptive information can survive over the long term. And sorry, the example of the rotten teeth actually is a better example of model biased transmission biases, where similar to what we had discussed last week with the leadership and political psychology interpretations of evolutionary psychology, where we have either a prestige or a dominance leadership. Here the names shift a little bit. We have either success-based modeling, where you copy the clear evidence of success of an individual, for example, higher hunting or better hunting skills, and so you copy these behaviors of that individual, which is obviously clearly linked to his success, but then in more in larger groups, and where the information is less clearly related to a specific behavior outcome, so we take these associations. If somebody is good at something, we then assume this individual would also be good at other things that have nothing to do with that particular skill, and so it's a copy of prestige model-based transmission bias, where we start copying individuals for specific traits that have nothing to do with their increased position that or the skills that led to their increased position in the first place. Right, so that again could explain some of the appeal of people like this very smart and altruistic individual here. So cultural transmission, we have all sorts of biases: prestige biases, success biases, novelty biases, conformist biases, and the issue here is that this can shift cultural norms, cultural traditions in specific ways. And the importance here is, and this is where other concepts like group selection come in, is that these behaviors need to be checked again in terms of the adaptiveness. Because if this happens, if we have runaway cultural evolutionary mechanisms based on these transmission biases, at some stage the behavior might not be adaptive anymore. Right? So this is one of the complexities of cultural transmission, and not having very clear transmission forms like memes, similar to genes in the natural selection biological transmission system, and having the problem to define what is actually fidelity in order to unpackage the whole idea of cultural evolution. So we have to always remember to put cultural evolution within this larger context of all sorts of genetic and environmental factors that influence each other. And this is, as I mentioned right at the beginning, cultural evolution has been researched for a much shorter period of time, and we have a long way to go, but also it's quite exciting because we're likely to make major breakthroughs or gain major insights in the next couple of years about the functioning of cultural evolution for human societies. So in summary, around the ideas of culture and cultural evolution so far, culture is a very fascinating topic from an evolutionary perspective. What we now know is that actually many animals show very specific cultural traditions. There's even evidence that some animals may have cumulative culture. The cumulative culture is most complex in humans, and we have to really work through what are species-specific task limits, and we also have to work through issues related to fidelity and transmission biases in order to better understand how cultural evolution works over time.